It was a little surreal to finally play Metroid Prime 4. And not just because it was one of the first games to be announced for the original Switch 8 years ago. I've also been there from the very start, meaning the launch of the original Metroid Prime in 2002. Back then, Mario creator Shigeru Miyamoto gave the newly formed US Nintendo team Retro Studios the task of reinventing the classic Metroid formula of exploring non-linear side-scrolling labyrinths into a first-person 3D game. They came up with an immersive exploration concept that still stands on its own. Even 2 decades later, the remaster, which kept the original design intact, was still one of the highest rated games that year. So among fans, the stakes for Metroid Prime 4 were high. Sadly, I wasn't able to really dive into the world building, which has always been one core appeal of the series. The demo, even behind closed doors, only featured the intro section, and that part was all about learning the controls. So that's what I mostly want to focus on here, because the control scheme actually came with a few surprises. In fact, thinking about it, experimental movement has always been a low-key pillar of this sub-series, starting with the original game, which used a lock-on system similar to action-adventures like Zelda or Dark Souls for the slow-paced investigation gameplay, which might have been a result of the GameCube's pretty bad second stick. It just wasn't a great fit for dual analog controls. The very first iteration of the Nintendo DS came with a demo of Metroid Prime Hunters of all things to demonstrate the touchpad, where you would aim with the stylus or a thumb pad. And then on the Wii, Metroid Prime Corruption was fully built around the pointer of the Wiimote controller, which I found very approachable. Now, if you've played the remaster of Prime 1, you'll feel right at home with Part 4. The stick controls are nearly identical from what I could tell. The original game was never a traditional shooter and fully attuned to its unconventional tank control system, which also felt appropriate for maneuvering a big, tanky space armor. However, the remaster implemented more conventional dual-stick controls, which was a concession for newcomers without trivializing the original concept. It worked great, so it's all intact here. Obviously, the game wasn't designed with the new Joy-Con mouse function in mind, as the original Switch didn't have that. But now, Metroid Prime 4 could become a showcase for this feature, especially after Drag and Drive didn't deliver. You can seamlessly switch it to the mouse mode anytime, and so far it's never felt interruptive or janky. It's also easy to reach the buttons for the rockets, morph ball ability, and the scanning feature. These features feel slightly cramped on the small Joy-Con when you hold it like a mouse, and a couple of times I might have tapped the wrong button, but I felt that it's something that's very easy to get used to. I will say though that the mouse function itself feels a little slow. It worked, but on the surface I was playing on, the cursor wasn't as snappy as I hoped for, which meant I had to lift the Joy-Con up and reposition it a few times. To be fair, I don't know how far you can calibrate the sensitivity in the menus. However, what surprised me was the additional motion controls. Similar to Prime 3, you can use the controller like a pointer. No doubt, back in the day, on the old Wii, there was a lot of lazy shovelware, using the motion control feature of the Wiimote controller for cheap waggle. But pointing at the monitor was always responsive and intuitive. On the first Switch, I never felt that the pointer was at the same level as the Wii, because the Joy-Cons used gyro mechanics instead of an IR pointer. But the Switch 2 gyro felt shockingly accurate. I didn't aim at the monitor at all, but the pointer never was out of sync with my movements. The tutorial section was all about learning to move the cursor freely while being in a lock-on, and that was my only irritation. The gyro worked incredibly well for me, but for some reason, motion control only work during the lock-on and then stop once you stop focusing on an enemy. I really hope that there will be an option to fully control the cursor with motion throughout the entire campaign, just like Part 3. Speaking of Metroid Prime 3, a few final remarks on the rest of what I played of Metroid Prime 4. Just like in the third game, you get a big action set piece at the beginning, as hostile aliens attack a marine facility, which even has its own giant mech for a short, scripted spectacle scene. However, it's much shorter than the action intro of Prime 3, which was like over an hour long. Here, maybe 10 to 15 minutes, if even that, before you get to the boss fight. Which isn't something to complain about, because again, the series isn't a traditional shooter. It's at its best once you get to start investigating a big open labyrinth. And as a short tutorial to learn the controls, it's a decent enough action scene. On the Switch 2, the outside area actually looks pretty impressive, on par with sci-fi games on PS5. Inside the facility though, it didn't look quite as sharp as something like Doom 2016, which I replayed recently. The boss fight itself was a little tedious because it wasn't particularly hard, but long. But again, getting a feel on the controls was my major takeaway here. Without really delving into the world itself, it's still hard to say how the game will hold up against its predecessors.